Nobody expected Johnny Depp to say yes to The View. Until Day Drinker. Until his comeback needed a stage big enough to matter. Joy Behar smiled when she found out he was coming. Not a friendly smile. The kind of smile that meant she already had a plan. Nobody in that studio knew what was coming. Not the audience, not the other hosts. 9 minutes into the interview, Joy leaned forward with a folder she definitely hadn't needed for softball questions about a movie. "Let's talk about why people should trust you again," she said. "After everything." The room went ice cold. Johnny Depp didn't flinch. "After everything," he repeated. "Which part of everything exactly? Because I have a feeling you're about to find out you picked the wrong version." What happened over the next 11 minutes would be clipped. Not because Johnny Depp raised his voice. He barely did. Because of what he pulled out of his own jacket pocket. Because of the exact date and time he recited from memory. Because of the question he asked Joy Behar. One she absolutely could not answer live, on camera, in front of millions of people. And then he stood up and walked off that stage the way a man walks out of a courtroom he already won. Subscribe right now, because you are about to watch a man who already survived the biggest trial of the decade absolutely dismantle someone who thought she could relitigate it live on television. The View studio was packed tighter than usual that morning. Word had leaked overnight that Depp was the guest, and standby lines had wrapped around the block since 5 a.m. At 62, Johnny Depp looked exactly like a man in the middle of a comeback. Day Drinker had wrapped. Penelope Cruz had called the shoot, "some of the most alive I've seen him in 15 years. Lionsgate was already talking sequel. The tabloids that had spent years writing his obituary were now writing think pieces about the greatest career resurrection in modern Hollywood. He walked onto the set, that familiar half-smile already working the room before he'd said a word. The applause was loud, louder than the producers had briefed anyone to expect. "Johnny Depp, everybody," Whoopi announced, and there was real warmth in her voice. "Thank you," Johnny said, folding himself into the chair with that unhurried, slightly theatrical grace he'd never lost. It's been a minute. The first 8 minutes moved exactly the way his team had scripted it in their heads. Day Drinker, working with Mark Webb, reuniting with Penelope for the 4th time since Blow. Johnny was funny, disarming, generous with the other guests, clearly enjoying himself in a way that surprised everyone who remembered how guarded he'd become. "This role required me to be still," he said, describing his character. "Which, if you know me, is the hardest thing in the world. I'm used to hiding behind wigs and gold teeth and eyeliner. This time there was nowhere to hide." The audience laughed warmly. Joy sat quietly through all of it. Too quietly. Her folder stayed closed on the table in front of her, but her eyes never left him. It was Sarah who opened the door without realizing it. "Johnny, this feels like such a real comeback moment for you. How does it feel being back in front of an American audience like this?" Johnny considered the question, his expression softening. "Honestly, terrifying. And wonderful. I spent a long time not knowing if I'd ever get to do this again. Sit in a room like this, talk about work I'm proud of, not have every word twisted into a headline before I finished the sentence." The audience applauded warmly. That's when Joy opened the folder. "Speaking of headlines, Johnny." The shift in her voice was instant. Every host at that table felt it. "Let's talk about why people should trust you again. After everything." The words landed like a dropped glass. Johnny set his water down. Slowly. Deliberately. "After everything," he repeated. "Which part of everything exactly?" "You know exactly which part," Joy said, opening the folder wider. "The trial. The allegations. Years of headlines about domestic abuse. And now you're just back. Movies, magazine covers, standing ovations. Doesn't that feel a little too easy?" The studio went dead silent. Too easy. Johnny's voice was quiet, almost amused, in a way that made the hair on Sarah's arms stand up. "You think 6 years of my life getting dismantled in public was easy?" I think a jury verdict doesn't erase everything people heard. A jury verdict, Johnny cut in. Based on evidence, audio recordings, text messages, sworn testimony from people who were actually in the room. Not tabloid headlines, Joy. Evidence. There were also credible allegations from multiple sources. Name one that held up in court. Johnny leaned forward slightly. Go ahead. You brought the folder. Read me one piece of evidence that survived cross-examination. Joy flipped a page, then another. I'm not here to relitigate the entire case. You just did. You brought a folder onto a national talk show to relitigate a case a jury already decided. So either commit to it, or don't bring it up at all. The audience had gone completely still. Joy tried again. The public has a right to be skeptical when someone with your history is suddenly being celebrated. My history. Johnny's tone hadn't changed, but something underneath it had. Let's actually talk about my history then, since you brought the folder and clearly didn't read it carefully. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small card, the kind actors keep with them for exactly this reason, filled with dates memorized for interviews they hoped they'd never need. May 27th, 2022. That's the day a jury of 7 people, after hearing 6 weeks of testimony, after listening to every recording, after reviewing every piece of evidence either side could produce, found unanimously that I had been defamed. Not partially, not with an asterisk, unanimously. He set the card down on the desk. That's not spin, Joy. That's not my publicist's version of events. That's a court of law. Courts get things wrong. Sometimes they do, Johnny agreed immediately, which seemed to throw her off. But you don't get to say that only when the verdict doesn't fit your narrative. Either the justice system means something or it doesn't. You can't pick and choose which verdicts you respect based on which celebrity you'd prefer to still hate. Joy's composure was starting to crack. I'm simply saying that survivors deserve to be believed. They do, Johnny said, and for the first time his voice carried real weight instead of calm control. Every single one. And that's exactly why what happened to me matters, Joy. Because when false allegations get amplified without scrutiny, it doesn't protect real survivors. It makes people doubt them. It makes the next real victim harder to believe, because the last high-profile case turned out to be built on recordings that told a completely different story than the headlines did. The studio was frozen. Even the camera operators had stopped their usual small movements. I sat in that courtroom for 6 weeks, Johnny continued, and listened to recordings of my own voice being played back to a jury. The worst version of myself, admittedly. Moments I'm not proud of. But I also sat there while the actual evidence came out. While recordings surfaced that told a very different story than the one printed in 100,000 headlines before anyone had heard a single piece of testimony. He paused, letting his words settle over the studio. Do you know what it does to a person to watch strangers online decide they know your marriage better than you did? To watch late-night hosts build monologues around a version of your life that bore almost no resemblance to what actually happened in your own home. I lost work. I lost friends who didn't wait for evidence before cutting me off. I lost years of my career that I will never get back. And through all of it, I never once asked anyone to just take my word for it. I waited for the evidence. I let the process play out. That doesn't mean everything was fabricated. I never said everything was simple, Johnny said, his voice dropping lower. Relationships are messy. Mine was messier than most, and I've said publicly, more than once, that I'm not proud of everything about it. But there's a difference between admitting I wasn't perfect and accepting a narrative that a jury, specifically, unanimously, rejected. He looked directly at her. So let me ask you something, Joy. You brought a folder today. You clearly prepared. Did you read the trial transcripts? Not the headlines, not the Twitter threads, the actual transcripts. Joy hesitated. I've read extensive coverage. That's not what I asked. The silence stretched 3 full seconds. I read summaries, Joy admitted, her voice noticeably smaller. You read summaries. Johnny repeated. You sat here, on national television with a folder, ready to relitigate 6 years of my life in front of millions of people, based on summaries, not evidence. Summaries written by people who had already decided the story before the trial even started. Sarah tried to interject gently. Maybe we should... No, Johnny said, not unkindly but firm. Let her finish making her point. I want to hear the rest of it. Joy straightened, trying to recover her footing. Fine, I'll finish it. Regardless of what a jury decided, there were years of reporting, multiple outlets, multiple sources, multiple outlets quoting the same original claim. Johnny interrupted. That's not corroboration, Joy. That's an echo. 10 newspapers repeating one allegation isn't 10 pieces of evidence. It's one claim wearing 10 different bylines. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Whoopi's hand drifted toward her earpiece, but she didn't move to cut in. That's the problem with what happened to me, Joy. Not that people asked questions. Questions are fair. Questions are healthy. The problem is that an entire industry decided the verdict before the evidence existed, and then couldn't admit they were wrong when the evidence said otherwise. He leaned back slightly. I lost roles. I lost a franchise worth billions of dollars. I lost years I will never get back, sitting at home wondering if I'd ever work again, based on a narrative that a jury specifically, publicly, unanimously rejected. And you're sitting here, folder in hand, ready to do it all over again because it makes better television. That's not fair, isn't it? Johnny's voice was almost gentle now, which somehow made it land harder. You just told me the public deserves to be skeptical of my comeback. Let me ask you the actual fair question then. Do you think a jury that heard 6 weeks of actual evidence knows more about what happened in my house than a folder of magazine clippings does? Joy didn't answer immediately. The pause stretched long enough that Sarah visibly winced on her behalf. I think, Joy finally said, that public figures don't get to hide behind a verdict forever. I'm not hiding behind anything. Johnny's voice was steady. I'm standing in front of you, on live television, answering every single question you're asking. That's the opposite of hiding, Joy. Hiding would be refusing to come on this show at all, which, frankly, is exactly what my team advised me to do. I came anyway, because I was done letting people write the ending to my story without me in the room. Joy opened her mouth. Nothing came out for a long moment. I think the public conversation is more complicated than a single verdict, she finally said. That's not an answer, that's a deflection. Johnny stood up slowly, and the movement commanded every eye in the studio. You wanted a real conversation, Joy? Here it is. You don't get to ask a man to defend 6 years of his life based on headlines you admit you didn't verify, and then call it journalism when he pushes back. He straightened his jacket. You want to know why I said yes to this interview? Because I was tired of only ever being asked about this in rooms where I couldn't respond, where the questions got asked and the headline got written before anyone waited for my answer. So go ahead, print whatever you want tomorrow. But this time, the whole thing is on camera. Every word, every folder page you never actually read from. Joy tried one final time. I still think the public has a right to ask hard questions. They have a right to ask informed questions, Johnny corrected her, quiet and final. There's a difference, and you just proved, on live television, that you didn't do the reading before you decided the verdict. He picked up the small card from the desk and slid it back into his jacket pocket. I spent 6 years being told I didn't deserve the benefit of the doubt, that evidence didn't matter as much as narrative, that a jury's unanimous decision was somehow less important than a headline. I'm done accepting that standard from anyone, especially someone holding a folder she admits she never actually read. He turned to Whoopi and Sarah with genuine warmth. Thank you both. I've always respected how this show actually lets people finish a sentence. Then to Joy, one final time, his voice quiet and almost kind. Next time you bring a folder onto national television, honey, read what's actually inside it first. Because today, All it proved was that you came here to relitigate a verdict you never bothered to understand. And with that, Johnny Depp, the man who had spent 6 years being tried twice, once in a courtroom and once in the court of public opinion, and won both, buttoned his jacket, nodded once to the stunned audience, and walked off the stage like a man who had absolutely nothing left to prove. The silence after he left was total. Joy Behar sat frozen, her folder still open on the table, her hands flat against its edges like she needed something to hold on to. Nearly a full minute passed before Whoopi finally spoke. "We need to take a break. Right now." Sarah was staring at the door Johnny had walked through. "I don't think anyone has ever done that to Joy. Not like that. Not with receipts." Alyssa sat frozen in her chair, her political instincts telling her this clip was about to dominate every news cycle for a week. Sunny said nothing at all. She simply reached over, quietly closed Joy's folder, and slid it away from the table. The clip hit 90 million views by the next morning. Johnny Depp destroys Joy Behar with a card in his pocket, trended worldwide within hours. But what people kept sharing wasn't just the takedown. It was the exact moment Joy admitted, live on air, that she'd only read summaries. Legal analysts dissected the exchange for days. Media critics called it the most devastating live correction of a media narrative in a decade. Penelope Cruz posted, "Watched this with my jaw on the floor. That's the man I worked with every single day. Calm, prepared, and always 3 steps ahead." Mark Webb, his day drinker director, wrote, 11 minutes, and he did more for due process than a decade of cable news panels combined. Even journalists who had covered the original trial extensively weighed in. One prominent legal correspondent wrote, "Depp did in 11 minutes what 6 years of press coverage failed to do. Force an actual reckoning with what the evidence said versus what the headlines claimed." Legal scholars began using the clip in media literacy classes, pointing to the moment Joy admitted reading only summaries as a teaching example of how narratives calcify before facts arrive. Fans dug up old courtroom sketches and side-by-side comparisons of headlines from the trial versus the actual jury findings, sharing them with captions like, "Read the transcript, not the tweet." The hashtag read the transcript trended for 2 full days. Joy Behar returned to The View 2 days later. She didn't apologize directly, but she opened with a brief, uncharacteristically careful statement about the importance of getting the full picture before forming an opinion. Viewers noticed she didn't bring a folder to a single interview for weeks. And Johnny Depp? He went back to work. Day drinker post-production. A new script already on his desk. Another chance to prove that the loudest headline isn't always the truest one, and that sometimes the quietest man in the room is the one holding all the actual evidence. What did you think of this confrontation? Was Joy out of line, or was she asking fair questions? Drop your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories that will absolutely blow your mind.